Hello and welcome to the Undercurrent News podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined by Robins McIntosh of CP Foods. Robins is a very globally renowned expert in the shrimp industry and very present in both the traditional shrimp industry and also overseeing the construction of a RAS non-coastal land-based farm. And I thought we'd start there, Robins, because we've had a little bit of a debate about what that is. I follow the salmon RAS space very closely, and I've been studying this effort to build facilities to grow RAS using recirculating technology. And yourselves, you're at the sort of vanguard of this by developing homegrown shrimp in the United States. And I thought, let's start there and perhaps tell us a little bit about that venture and how it fits into the broader shrimp markets.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on some of these subjects today. RAS is a very broad term. Now, most people, when we think RAS, they think of pumps, filters, and all of these noisy things. But RAS only means recirculating aquaculture. So even in Ecuador with large ponds, farms there have started to recirculate within their farms. So that is a form of RAS. The form of RAS that we're adapting at Homegrown Shrimp in Florida is not with all the big external filters, but I call it more internal RAS, where I use biological systems within the tank to achieve what biofilters would achieve outside the tank. And the reason for doing that is it's less costly, less mechanical. It does put a cap on your production. So the cap on production is something like 5 kilograms per cubic meter. Whereas if I was going with mechanical RAS, we could go up to maybe 10 kilograms or 11 or 12 kilograms per cubic meter. But this is a lower cost. For us, it's an easier step because we have a large amount of experience doing this in my nuclear breeding centers in Thailand, where we have been inland RAS using the same water for 10 years. And using the same type of heterotrophic or nitrifying flock type internal filtration. So we have good confidence in it working, and we just have to work within the boundaries that type of technology set in terms of your aerating biomass in the system. The next step would, of course, be to go to a more mechanical once we have more confidence in consistency of those systems.
Right. And Robins, we've had a conversation before this, and we were talking about there's been, decades of effort to try and make this type of technology work for, growing shrimp close to urban centers, away from the, these vast kind of swaths of coastal land in Asia where they're grown now. And most of these ventures have failed. And you mentioned that with an advancement in genetics, specifically from CP, there's been some progress in these systems, maybe working and somebody eventually cracking the code to grow shrimp in a RAS system.
Well, again, we're dealing with tropical shrimp. These are not cold water shrimp. Tropical shrimp. Generally, these shrimp need a warmer temperature. So when you're in the market countries that we target this for, Europe, United States, Canada, the colder areas of China, we must keep the temperatures warm. A lot of people will say 28 degrees, 27 degrees, but that's suboptimal for growth. You can do it, but again, the longer the cycle, the more the risk, the higher the cost. So we're trying to achieve an indoor atmosphere or environment where we can maintain 30 degrees year round, which is very close to optimal growth. So we can achieve those growth rates that can allow us to have cycle times of 65, 70 days. In the future, I hope we can get that down even faster, because again, when we do the economics, it's not per cycle, it's per year. So you can either do the economics by increasing the biomass per cubic meter of culture area, or you can improve the economics by improving the number of cycles you do per year. And therefore, it's the summation of the cycles that lead to the annual economics. And that's a safer way to go. So we're looking at doing 4 cycles a year. Hopefully in the future, we can achieve 5 or 6 cycles a year. So if we're doing that 5 kilograms or 6 kilograms per square meter, you know, we can still have 6 times 5, say 30 kilograms per square meter per year. And then, of course, the other part of the economic is the amount of space utilization you have. So what the expensive thing is the building. It's the artificial environment you create to maintain these conditions. And you're not using 100% of that expensive space, but what percentage are you using? You know, currently we'll be using like 65% per tank per square meter, but is there a way of getting it to 85%? Is there a way of maybe doing some more stacking? So again, we have more vertical use of space in these expensive buildings.
Yeah, yeah. And recently we held a webinar on RAS technology, and Nutreco New Frontiers, Eric Spheric was telling us that, you know, the shrimp space just isn't quite there yet. Nobody's proven the costs. The costs have to come for sure. That we're talking about a niche product, so it's a bit like salmon, where, you know, you would expect to achieve a premium price to supply a fresh, never frozen, antibiotic-free, locally sourced shrimp. But his point was that the costs are just way out of sync with regular coastal farming. So what do you think about that? And do you think that gap can be closed?
Well, there certainly is a gap. And again, a lot of it is the capitalization. In terms of performance, I think that the performance can be very similar if you don't go outside of boundaries. But if, because of your capital costs, you have to increase the biomass and the pressure you put on the system, then you're going to decrease consistency, and it's all about consistency. It's about survival. So on a good coastal site, when we're doing well, you're at 80–85% survival. You're an FCR of 1.2. You're at a cycle time of maybe 80–85 days. You have a labor cost. You have a production. Many of those numbers can still be achieved indoors. We can still basically have an FCR of 1.2. We can still have a survival of 85%. But what we must have is that artificial environment we create, which is a capital cost we don't have in Asia. Now, where RAS has run into problems, as I understand it, again, I'm just getting into this space a little bit, but it seems that there's low survival and very little consistency. And consistency is a cost. So if I only have one successful crop every 3 crops, then, you know, that's going to be a very high cost. If every crop I can bet on 85% survival, I can bet on 70 days to get my crop out, I can bet on an FCR of 1.2, 1.3, then I've got a relatively operating low cost. Now you also have to put depreciation and the other costs of capital in there. But in terms of the operating costs, I personally don't see that there has to be a huge difference between Asia and these systems. Where there is a huge difference is in the capitalization costs. But it's all about that consistency and risk, which the industry has not shown. I mean, we basically have very low survivals on average. I don't know what the average survival is on RAS, but if it was below 50%, it wouldn't surprise me. Why is that? You know, so when I started this little journey of doing this, I had one question to myself: why do the shrimp die? Why do they die? And until we can really answer that question, I think there'll always be questions about these RAS systems. But shrimp die for a reason. They die for a reason. Shrimp don't just die. But we really don't have a firm grasp of what that reason is. I do know when we moderate densities, when we moderate and we stay within the bounds of the technology we're trying to implement, you can certainly have the consistency, but the question is, are those bounds and that consistency at such a low productivity you can't pay for the environment? And that's where I think we get into trouble. We push the systems harder than they're constructed to build. And so our consistency is not there, our survivals are not there. And therefore, in the end, it looks like our costs are very, very high.
Right, right. Of course, we couldn't go through this interview without mentioning the post larvae in your background there. And I understand that those are the CP post larvae, and you've mentioned that this breed of shrimp is doing a lot better in a RAS environment than maybe other types of post PLs in the past. Do you think that can be the differentiating factor in making this work?
Well, I think, it's healthy PLs. I'm not going to say CP PLs per se, but we need healthy shrimp. Shrimp, there's a combination of factors in making a healthy shrimp, a healthy PL. But, the shrimp that we're developing is not for RAS per se, but where RAS does have a big advantage, it should be totally biosecure. So when I'm running a non-coastal RAS and I'm using maybe my own made up seawater and I'm recycling it, and I'm using a post-larvae source that I have high degree of confidence brings no pathogens into my system, which is essential, essentially, I'm not having to fight named diseases. I still have stress, which will bring on chronic vibriosis, which is the big issue, I believe. But in terms of the named diseases, the white spots, the EHPs, the EMSs, the IMNVs, you're not having to deal with that. So you're really concentrating on minimizing stresses within your system and maximizing that output. So we basically concentrate on providing healthy animals. And then in terms of the genetics, I don't have to concentrate on creating named disease tolerance. So I don't have to put effort into white spot tolerance, IMNV tolerance, Taura tolerance. I can concentrate pretty much 100% on basic robustness and growth. Because when I look at the economics, and that's assuming that we don't have any named diseases. So, if I'm doing it right, I can get my 85% survival. And the economics then revolve around growth, cycle time, how long to grow the shrimp. And of course, growth is related to FCR. The longer in the cycle, the higher my FCR, the lower the survival, higher my FCR. But if I can get a shrimp out in 70 days, 60 days, with a survival of 85%, I'm going to have an FCR below 1.2. And so that's the economics right there. And so, yes, for indoor RAS systems, we introduced a strain this year where I really had put no effort into selecting for disease tolerance. Robustness, yes, because you do need a certain amount of robustness, but it was all about growth. And so we call that the Bolt line after Usain Bolt, fastest human being alive. This is the fastest shrimp alive. And I believe it's done very well. Again, the aim is to get more cycles per year, to get the shrimp in, to get the shrimp out, or get the shrimp out before it dies.
Right. And you mentioned this 50-day mark where in previous RAS ventures, the shrimp tend to die. It seems like they get vibriosis and it doesn't die. I mean, would you say the genetics obviously, if you can speed up the growth cycle with the genetics, that brings you to maybe, to 50 days. But do you think there are other ways that, that challenge of why, as you say, why the shrimp die after a 50-day period, is there some other solution within the RAS system that could, solve that problem?
Well, again, we're going to make some assumptions. They don't all just die at 50 days. We start to see, and this is a generalization, 50, 60 days, my impression is we generally start to see a chronic mortality. That doesn't mean massive. They just start dying a little bit by little bit. And that's the worst kind, because you tend to keep that cycle going. And every time you lose a shrimp, you've lost all the feed. You've lost, time and production. And at the end, maybe you only have 30% survival or 35% survival. So it eats away at you over time. Now, we basically have been doing those numbers with the same type of growth material. And so it's the same type of feed rates. But I think when we are growing twice as fast, we're going to be feeding twice as much. And that might translate into chronic mortality starting at 30 days, because it probably has to do with the input into the system and the stresses that input costs relative to the way the engineering is to take care of those inputs. So if we're dealing with outside RAS and we're putting in this massive amount of nitrogen because they're massive eaters, then you're going to have to be pumping water in and out of that system so fast, there's going to be an energy cost to it. And is that even worthwhile? So it's not a simple straight line solution for anything. There's all these interacting factors of feed rates, growth rates, your filtration rates, all of this is interacted in such a way that I don't think we've really come to fully comprehend how complex this equation will end up being. For me, right now, it's to take a baby step. It's to go with moderate carrying capacity. Yes, highly dependent on the market, because it's definitely going to be more expensive, mostly because of the capital, than growing them in Asia or South America. So we never want to compete with those shrimp. Those are the broilers. Those are your everyday shrimp. We basically are going for a market that's a premium shrimp. It has to be, at least now. In the future, 20 years from now, I don't know. But right now, it is. But it's a baby step. And you have to take the baby step before we go to the next step. And hopefully over time, we will learn, more about these interrelated factors and how they interact with one another. And also learn more about the markets. Certainly being produced closer to home, we're going to save on some transport costs. We're going to save on some processing costs. There's some costs we save, as well as the additional costs that we have. But all of this it's kind of an interesting voyage. And this is the first step. It's not the final step. And we have to, every time we do something, instead of just repeating it, we have to ask, what went wrong? How can we do it better? And try to improve on it. Understanding that what homegrown is today, homegrown will not be in 10 years. It will be a totally evolved system. As you ask the hard questions, how can we do this better? What can we do? And again, I think that RAS, historically, we haven't asked enough questions. Why do they die? Simple question. Why do they die?
Would you say CP has got into this more as a learning process more than, and for that kind of, implementing a proper kind of, I guess, autopsy process to RAS farming versus maybe some of these, most of these ventures have been smaller entrepreneurs who try it, fail, and disappear, and that learning process maybe kind of dissolves into the mist. But would you say it's more like a learning process for CP?
Everything is a learning process for everybody, or it should be. And if it's not a learning process, I don't think your life is going to be very long and successful. For CP, we started this process 12 years ago. So as I said, in terms of the brood stock, I mean, I started RAS, if you want to look at Belize aquaculture, back in Belize in '96. I mean, that was a first kind of RAS system that people said would never work. You can't do it. I mean, I was told that 100 times. It won't work. You can't do it. Well, today we don't do Belize aquaculture type RAS, but I've evolved that into our SPF broodstock facilities and nuclear breeding facilities. And that now is being evolved into what we're doing for food production. It's just an evolution of that, really. And the next evolution, as I said, will be to try to get better space utilization on these expensive buildings. So instead of maybe the 5 times 4, the 20 kilograms per square meter, and if I'm doing 70% utilization of that, then we're maybe only 15 kilograms per square meter of building. You know, if I can get that to 30 kilograms per square meter of building, that's a huge improvement. How to do that? You know, will it be an improvement in survival, an improvement in growth and turns? Or will it be an improvement of tank placement? Will it be an improvement of better vertical utilization of water space within a tank? All of these things will be possible when people ask questions and say, things can do better. We can always do better. I know with my team from the very beginning, they would always say, oh, we're the best. And I'd say, look, I'm not going to argue that you're not the best, but that doesn't mean we can't be better. We can always be better, and you should always strive to be better.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when we think about this in the context of the bigger shrimp market, I mean, it sounds like this is very many years off being any type of competition for, as you say, the broiler chicken, the regular coastal shrimp farming industry. What would you say is the future outlook for the regular industry? Because there is a very big mortality rate, and a lot of consumers around the world question the provenance of some of the shrimp that comes from Southeast Asia and, well, from South America as well. The mortality rates, the use of antibiotics. I mean, how do you see it all evolving together, all these different pieces?
Well, for me, there clearly is room to improve. In fact, there's a lot of room to improve. And certainly some of the new technologies that are becoming useful now, applicable now, will go a long ways in improving some of these efficiencies. So if we're at 60% efficiency in a coastal farm, back in 2010, we were at 90%. We've lost 30% efficiency because of these diseases and changing environment. You know, and that's a whole nother discussion. Why is this happening? But it is happening. Right. And so we need to apply some of these new technologies in innovative ways to address this and try to get it back to 90% survival. Because as I said, shrimp don't just die. They die for a reason. Thailand back in 2010, 85, 90% survival on average. You know, anything less than 85 was a failure. Now, you know, if you had 65, you're considered a success. So we've changed the bar in the wrong direction. It needs to go back in the right direction. It's a lot more difficult now. There's no question coastal waters are not as clean as they used to be. There's no question now that climate change has created a lot more Vibrio background. They've created a lot more issues in maintaining good environments, which all become stress. And stress is equal to disease. So when your shrimp are less stressed, they're not, the pathogen can be there, but there's no disease. Right now, with the stresses that are in our environment, with the climate change, the deteriorating conditions, the prevalence of pathogens, it's become much more difficult. And so we have to ask serious questions on how to best address that. And they are being asked, and you know, I think in time, these new technologies will be picked up in such a way that farmers will greatly benefit from them.
What would you say are the really big technologies that can impact coastal farming the soonest?
A lot of it is basic, and that's where we really missed the boat, because right now EHP is probably the biggest impact in shrimp farming today, at least in Asia. And we don't have a basic understanding of this disease. Until we gained a basic understanding of EMS, the parahemolyticus problem, we had a very hard time dealing with that one. But as soon as we understood the basics of that disease, that it really wasn't an infection, it was a toxicosis, it was in the sludge areas of the ponds, we were then able to create innovative management techniques that really has mitigated that disease. But we don't understand enough about EHP to bring in the innovations that are needed to deal with it. So that's kind of a discouragement, and you know, it's also an encouragement that we need basic science to understand a disease before you can go and create the applied methodologies to deal with it. Otherwise, it's what I call the ant methodology of everybody is going out and trying everything, and maybe somebody comes upon the lucky hit, and then we try to go back and see what he did right. But it's a very inefficient way of doing it. And so far it hadn't worked with EHP. And nothing really has worked in such a way that it's changing the equation. We still have higher losses from EHP every year. So we need to change that trend line. So we need to apply some of these technologies to understand the disease, and then come up with what we've always done in the past, the innovative management and the genetics and the health. Again, we've lost track of health. You know, everybody wants to talk about genetics. It's one of my rants that in the beginning, back in the 80s, if you had a bad crop, the feed was bad. And then in the 90s, if you had a bad crop, the PL was bad. And today, if you have a bad crop, it's the genetics and broodstock are bad. No, it's basically all comes down to the health. And the health is the management and the animals and the water and the stresses and you know, being somewhat commonsensical in terms of your pond carrying capacities and not stretching the system. You know, the worst sin of shrimp farming is exuberance. When things go well, you just want to get more and more and more until it crashes. That's the history of shrimp farming. Right now, we've crashed and we got to work our way back and hopefully learn exuberance is not a good thing.
Is that crash, do you think, going to translate into lower global supply? You know, we've heard of many problems with Indian producers not being profitable right throughout the value chain. Is there some kind of impact that we will see in the global supply numbers in the next year or two?
I'm not really good at prediction on time, but historically, shrimp industries have gone up and they've come down, especially when they're growing. And I think one of the statistics I once looked at, when an industry grows by 15% for 3 straight years, there's usually going to be a trend in the other direction. You know, more of a constant growth rate would be 5% a year. That seems to be more, quote, sustainable. But when people get exuberant, it goes up 15, 20% a year for 3 straight years or 4, you know, that's almost too fast to sustain. And so where I see the vertical lines of growth, I do get concerned about that, because what that generally means is those growth rates are being increased by increasing density, not increasing numbers of farms, but increasing density is the way you do that rapid growth. And when you increase both the density within a pond and the density of ponds within an area, and then the third sin is not taking any time off between cycles, those 3 combinations generally do not have a good ending.
Right. Yeah, okay. So to bring it back forward, and I think we're at about time for the interview, but to bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, I mean, do you see at some point some of these technologies, or the growing ability with recirculating technology, is that just some little niche within the shrimp industry, or do you see some of this understanding and science benefiting the whole industry in the future?
No, absolutely. I mean, again, anything that comes out of RAS, will basically, there'll be some things that can be, but you have to get to it with a deeper understanding than superficial understanding. So you have to ask a lot of questions. But certainly things that we learn in RAS will be applied out of doors, because it's all culturing shrimp. Likewise, things outdoors can be applied indoors. And we just need to be again, I think one of the places where shrimp have suffered is this thinking that all RAS is the same. Fish RAS is the same as any aquatic animal. And fish and shrimp and fish are not the same animal. So things that are required by shrimp are different than are required by fish. And in some ways, shrimp are more difficult. And the big difference is the feces. So shrimp RAS has been based on taking out feces, which are compact and easily removed by screens, keeps the water relatively clean. Shrimp, the feces dissolve. It becomes an organic solution. And that's why the flock works better than to try to use a belt filter on it like a fish. That doesn't say that doesn't work, but shrimp feces and fish feces are totally different. Fish are three-dimensional animals. Shrimp, for the most part, are, well, I'll take it back. There's a three-dimensionality to them, but there's also a two-dimensionality to shrimp. And unless you learn how to break down the two-dimensionality to three-dimensionality, a fish, again, give you a big advantage in developing deep tanks, which, again, develop space within an expensive building. So you got dimensionality differences, you got the feces differences, you got feeding differences, but where shrimp have the big advantage is you can get a crop out in 60 days. So your cash flow can be much, much better than, say, with a fish. So there are pros and cons, but there are differences, and that's where I think we don't really look. We just apply what we learned at fish and just assume a shrimp is going to do well in that, and that's not the case.
Yeah, and you know, when I look at the different systems as a non-scientist, but the salmon industry seems to converge on, maybe they're in agreement about most of the technology used in RAS systems. Maybe there's some differences in opinion about the way the biofilter works in salmon. What I see in shrimp is a wide variety of ideas of how to make it work. There's obviously biofloc, which is an established technology in shrimp farming. There are other people who talk about using clean water. Other people that have some newfangled device that will, and there's every actor in this RAS space seems to have their own proprietary technology. Do you feel like there's going to be convergence on it, like a single technology that works?
One, there's no such thing as proprietary. There's proprietary what you think that you know, but basically everything is out there if you want to find it. Will there be convergence? At some time there may be, but I'll also say this: both those systems work if you understand the boundaries. The problem is when you're dealing with the clear water, that type of RAS, generally the costs when you're doing your spreadsheet production says, I have to stock a very high density, and it exceeds what that system will do comfortably, because you have to economically to make it work. When we're in the flock system, it tends to work at lower densities, it's lower cost. It's still expensive because you got a building which you can't pay for necessarily as well as with a more dense system. But if you don't push the numbers on the flock, which you call a flock, and I don't use the word heterotrophic flock any longer either. I use nitrifying flock because I want a clearer water system. Flock is dirty. That's not necessarily always a good thing. But it is a flock. It's in the tank processing. If you don't push the production of that, so it doesn't go outside the boundaries, that can be very consistent. If, again, you understand the downside of the technology. But I do see over time and evolution, as we learn more about increasing densities and floor space utilization, and I see a hybrid, probably a hybrid between outside filtration and inside filtration. But you never want a dense flock. Dense flock is one of the most misunderstood concepts. You want a thin flock that basically takes care of the water quality, but you're not interested in feeding the shrimp flock. Flock's a horrible food. It's good for taking care of water quality.
Right. It's going to be fascinating to watch the Homegrown Shrimp story, and as that facility comes online in 2022, so we'll be looking out for that. That's kind of all we got time for. So Robins, thanks very much for joining us on the podcast. truly appreciate it. And I think that would be a really great conversation for everybody, you know, thinking about these new technologies and how it applies to the shrimp industry. So thanks again. Thanks
Well,
for
it's been
joining me.
enjoyable. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.